He prophesied that he would ascend to heaven on December 31st, 1920, and about 6,000 of his followers disposed of all their belongings and gathered with Bedward in August Town for the ascension into heaven. Are they at that table? Investigation, reduce spending. We don't really have a problem with it. Before European religions became deep-rooted in the society, Jamaicans practiced many forms of spiritualism, including Pocomania, Revivalism, and Bedwardism. Bedwardism was a movement started by Alexander Bedward, a self-proclaimed healer from Augustown in St. Andrew. Born in Matilda's Corner, Bedward grew up in Augustown, and it is said that his mother was a healer, but not much is known about his father. Bedward was not very literate, and he worked as a laborer until about 1880-1881, when he began to have these vivid dreams that he interpreted as a calling for religious vocation. So he started attending the Baptist church and was soon inducted as one of the elders at the Native Baptist Church in Augustown. But Bedward was a strong believer in the healing power of nature, and so by 1891 he left his plantation job and began performing healing ceremonies at a spring on his property near the Hope River. Soon, Bedward was performing these healing ceremonies weekly and was hosting fasting for his followers 3 times a week. His followers grew to thousands of people as news spread about these healing ceremonies by the spring and Hope River. The rapid growth of Bedward's movement may have been due to several factors, including that Jamaica was going through an economic crisis at that time, and many Afro-Jamaicans were still very attuned to their spiritual African roots. He named the Hope River Holy Water, and it became a conduit for visits to the other world and encounters with angels and spirits, and as a source for healing and rebirth through baptism. And that's where the song Dip Them Bedward Dip Them comes from.
Dip them Bedward, dip them in a healing stream. Dip them sweet but not too deep, dip them for your bad feeling. Me always go pa the Augustown, but me never go pa Mona. One day me was invited by one old man them called Jonah. When me go up pa Mona, me see Brother Bedward stand up. Him take Sister Mary full in hand and him dip her in a healing stream. Oh, dip them Bedward, dip them in a healing stream.
His ceremonies were adorned with white wooden crosses and white cups to drink the living water and flags, and he mixed in African vocalizations with Bible utterances, so that drew in many people. His ceremonies were captivating for them. Thousands of people would gather every Wednesday to hear his sermons, and these sermons were very fiery. He used to hit out at the privileged class and other pastors as well as physicians for charging fees for their healing. It's said that at one point he even proclaimed himself to be Jesus Christ and prophesied the imminent end of the world when God would reward the just and punish the wicked. The privileged class and the British colonial authorities did not take kindly to this growing movement of Bedwardism, and he was under surveillance until he was finally arrested on January 16, 1895 and charged with sedition. Bedward's white lawyer launched a vigorous defense in front of an all-white jury that he had been framed by the police and none other than the Daily Gleaner, as the prosecution had taken its case directly from an article published in the Gleaner. Bedward was acquitted, but was declared a lunatic and committed to the asylum. The governor would later say that although Bedward was personally harmless, the potential effect of his sermons on an ignorant and excitable public and his susceptibility to manipulation by designing or devious men made him a political threat. Released from the asylum on a technicality, Bedward's movement grew even stronger, from 7,000 to 36,000 by 1920. He had congregations in Jamaica, in Cuba, and in other parts of the Caribbean, even in Panama, where he once worked as a migrant laborer. As Jamaica's economic conditions grew even worse, Bedward himself became convinced that the world was coming to an imminent end. he prophesied that he would ascend to heaven on December 31st, 1920, and about 6,000 of his followers disposed of all their belongings and gathered with Bedward in August Town for the ascension into heaven. When the day came and he obviously did not ascend, Bedward declared that he had ascended into heaven in spirit and that he would postpone his bodily ascension. While he did lose some followers after that fiasco, Bedward's movement largely continued. Some followers moved into the compound in St. Andrew and they spent the day fasting and praying and singing and chanting. But members of the surrounding community were not so welcoming of the Bedward movement and their members, partly because there were complaints that some of them were vagrants and were stealing from the properties of nearby neighbors. In 1921, Bedward prophesied that a tidal wave would engulf the city of Kingston. And on April 27, defying a police ban, he led a procession towards the city. He was met by both the military and the police, and when he was arrested this time, he was committed to the asylum for good. He died in the asylum in 1930, and his son-in-law, George Burke, took over as leader of the Bedward movement. But Burke was no Alexander Bedward, and soon the congregation was depleted. Now, some say that Bedward was a cult leader, and others say that he was just, out of his mind, an insane person. But I think that Bedward's movement has to be looked at in the context of it came up after the 1865 rebellion. And there was a tendency not just to demonize any of these spiritual movements that did not fit into the European standard of homogeneous Christianity that they wanted everyone to follow, but also that after the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, the white population, the ruling class, was very wary of any black movement that looked like it had great influence over the mass of the black population. And because Bedward was so influential, he had 125 congregations at the height. And I believe that that in itself seemed very threatening to the ruling class, to the privileged class at that time, because he commanded too much influence as a black person. Them committing him to an asylum as an insane person, to me, is not very different from the way that we have been taught that Rastafarianism and Rastafarians were crazy people for believing what they believed. Regardless of how he is perceived, Bedward's influence cannot be denied. But his demise is also a warning that when you are perceived by the ruling class as having too much influence and power, then you are deemed as a threat, and they will use the state resources to ensure that this threat is no longer present.